Few people in the 1920s believed that this prosperity would have its limits and that would eventually plateau and cool off. The prices on the stock market continued to climb, and it created this fool's paradise that people were eager to invest in and try for the first time. Just as many people were using credit to buy luxury items like refrigerators and automobiles, people were also able to get access to purchasing stocks through a line of credit. This became known as purchasing stocks on the margin, where you would pay only a fraction of the stock's value with a promise to repay that loan with interest as the price of the stock grew. Now, that's all good and well until the price of the stock drops, and then what a creditor is left holding is an unsecured loan that's not being repaid, and the house of cards starts to collapse. So we see this come to its apex in October of 1929. Now, there had been tremors of a cool down, a stock market cool down, earlier in October as British institutions started to withdraw their investments abroad and place them in more secured investments at home. Speculators that were in tune with this also started to withdraw, and eventually the rumor that banks did not have enough cash on hand to pay off loan investments circulated, and many banks on Black Tuesday, October 29th, closed their doors as customers tried to make good on pulling their investments. By the end of 1929, $40 billion in paper value, at least on the books, had been lost. And really what that accumulates to is a greater amount of debt than the cost of World War I for the United States. This will lead to the most prolonged and prostrating event in American history, known as the Great Depression. No other industrialized nation experienced the level of suffering and setbacks as the United States did. Now, that makes sense considering the fact that the United States was the one industrial nation remaining unscathed pretty much by World War I. And so we see a particular level of hunger and despair and trauma in the American population, where over the decade prior, through the 1920s, much of Europe had struggled as it tried to rebuild from the destruction of World War I. The misery and gloom during this Great Depression is really incalculable. Oftentimes, it's best captured by photographs and personal narratives about how people suffered through this time. In this particular image, we have a young man selling off his Chrysler 75, which a year earlier had cost him about $1,500. That's roughly twice the average annual income. So this guy is relatively well off if he's spending what today would equate to about $120,000 on an automobile. Here he is selling it a year later for $100. So roughly a sixth of the annual income, which would be about $10,000 by today's standards. So I'm not sure if you're an auto head or junkie, but $120,000 car, we're looking at a pretty fancy car to be sold for $10,000. Heck, high school senior could purchase that as their beat around vehicle as they head off to college. By the end of 1929, 4 million Americans were left jobless. 2 years later, that number will have tripled to 12 million Americans, roughly greater than 10% of the population. 5,000 banks are going to collapse in the first 3 years of the Great Depression, And that's particularly significant to the average American because while most Americans did not have a great investment in the stock market, through the 1920s, Americans had been able to stock away money in savings accounts in American banks. It seems like a reasonable and frugal thing to do, to put money in a savings account. However, when these banks collapsed, there was no protection for savings accounts like there are today, and people's limited savings were wiped out by the closure of this bank. Countless thousands of homes and farms were lost to foreclosure. Bread lines and soup lines became the way that Americans, especially in urban areas, were able to get meals when they could. The level of stress and trauma spiked. Suicide rates, especially amongst men who were the family breadwinners and blamed themselves for their family's troubles. Even fertility rates dropped during this particular decade. Women had fewer babies. This image, I like this image because this is by artist John Langley Howard, and it was created in 1934, and he was a social realist. And so here we have pictures of dispirited Americans standing in an unemployment line during the Depression. This was supposedly in California, and it was outside of the Coit Tower in San Francisco. Now, this particular mural was commissioned by the federal government under Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal, the Public Works and Arts Project. And so John Langley Howard was paid by the government to paint images, and what he painted were images of what he was seeing as people really struggled during the Great Depression. So we have cause and consequence here with this particular image. The cause of this photo is the Great Depression and suffering. Because of that suffering, eventually we get the Roosevelt administration of the New Deal. We get the Public Artworks Project, which helped people, starving artists like Howard, find a way through the Great Depression. Overspeculation alone can't account for the level of despair and the depth of this economic depression alone. And so this lecture is going to review several ways that the Great Depression was caused. Now, bear with me because I'm not going to go in the order of the book. I've made this more thematic. And so the first theme, or the first cause that I really want to address here concerning the Depression is overproduction. Okay? Overproduction of goods. The 1920s were a time of plenty, and the 1930s, you would have thought, were also times of prosperity because businesses continued to produce goods despite the lack of a demand. So through overproduction, as well as overcapitalization, and what I mean by that is business owners continued to build their factories and build their companies and invest in new technology that reduced the labor force to a point that it was a self-inflicted wound. So why would they do this? It was because credit continued to be available through the 1920s and early 1930s. And so business owners, wanting to make up for lost profits, tried to do that through increasing production. And we've seen this in the past with farmers. Business owners are going to continue to do that. They are hooked on this horn of plenty. And so while the reasonable thing here to do would have been to reduce production and wait for demand to catch up with supply, business owners didn't do that. And of course, there wasn't going to be a demand for these goods because laborers, the those people that made up consumers were getting laid off. They were being laid off because a lack of demand for production, but more importantly, they were being laid off because business owners were investing in new technologies that reduced the labor force. Okay. And so this really is kind of a self-inflicted wound on the behalf of big business, because through easy credit and better technology, prices are getting inflated. The consumer's demand is going to diminish as a consequence of fewer jobs and lower wages. Supporting these pro-business policies, the environment that made it easy for companies to overcapitalize, overinvest, reduce the labor force, and reduce wages, was a series of Republican presidents. We've got Warren G. Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and then Herbert Hoover, who stood for traditional conservative stand-patism. What that means is to keep the status quo and really return or move back towards a pro-production kind of political climate. So here's Warren G. Harding. And Harding came from Ohio. In fact, he is hand-selected by a political machine in Ohio known as the Ohio Gang. And really, if you've ever heard the figure of speech of politics taking place in a smoke-filled room, the National Republican Convention was held in Ohio, and Warren Harding had very little political experience. He was a likable guy. He was somewhat of a regional celebrity, and these political bosses in Ohio pick him for two reasons. Number one, he's well liked by the public. He's handsome. He's charming. He makes people feel good about themselves. But really, what Warren G. Harding had as the best character for a presidential candidate, at least according to this political machine, was that he was easily manipulated. He was controllable. We will go through a couple of examples of how Harding's administration was one of the most corrupt administrations. Even though the president himself was not necessarily corrupt, his administration ran amok under his leadership. And really what Harding and this old guard of Republicans wanted to do was return to a pro-business environment, or what some historians have called a new laissez-faire, meaning that not only should the government stay out of business, but that the government should take a proactive approach to encouraging business. So this is like the antidote to the progressive era, which had worked towards helping labor, worked towards greater social equality and social security. Under Harding and these stand-patters, they're going to work towards using government for the benefit of the commercial class, business owners. So here's a political cartoon coming from the Harding administration. And once again, corporations could be relaxed. Antitrust laws under Harding were ignored, circumvented, feebly enforced by friendly prosecutors. The Interstate Commerce Commission was dominated by pro-business sympathetic managers of the railroad. There was a push to reprivatize the railroad. We'll talk about that here in a second. There was a push to get rid of the War Commerce Board, or the War Production Board, which had been so effective in reining in the excesses of business during World War I. And so big industrialists really were able to breathe a sigh of relief after the progressive era restraints. And we see some walking back of laws and legislation that had been passed during World War I. For example, a reduction in wages. So in this political cartoon, we can see that it's satirizing the corruption of the Harding administration, and that Washington, D.C. is indeed for sale. They're selling the Capitol. They're selling the Washington Monument. They're selling off parts of the military. And in fact, that did happen. The Merchant Marine, which was basically the government controlled merchants during a time of war, were reprivatized. And so many of the ships that the Merchant Marine had owned were sold to private businesses. And so private business is making a big haul here under the Harding administration. And we'll talk about two examples of where private interests and corruption really ran amok during Harding's administration. Two of the more competent yet equally pro-business members of Harding's cabinet are Andrew Mellon, who was the Secretary of Treasury, and he becomes one of the first proponents of tax cuts in favor of big business. And so Mellon and his tax cuts during the Harding administration, we see today in our own political climate discussions about tax cuts and who they should benefit. Should it benefit the middle and working classes, or should tax cuts take place in order to benefit the those that own production, those that are at the top of the heap, and that through tax cuts they will open up more job opportunities or open up more factories and that kind of thing where more people can work. So we get that conversation going with Andrew Mellon. And then on the other side, we have Herbert Hoover. Now, Herbert Hoover had been the manager of the War Labor Board during World War I. And under Harding, he becomes the Secretary of Commerce. And really why I want to stop here and talk about Herbert Hoover, who really gets blamed, not entirely fairly, for the Great Depression, but the politics of Herbert Hoover really encapsulate why the Great Depression happens. As we walk back away from these progressive reforms, Herbert Hoover, as the Secretary of Commerce of the wing of the executive branch that's supposed to exercise control over corporations, his political philosophy is that corporations really should regulate themselves, okay? Voluntary regulation and cooperation amongst corporations instead of government oversight and mandate. Now, you can imagine how well that works for corporations or for any individual with its own private interests to regulate itself. That would be like me saying, you know, at this point, I'm not going to issue homework, right? I want you to manage yourselves. I want you to be responsible for deciding how much studying and how much material is enough. We're not going to do that because we can see where that leads, right? So corporations are going to pretty much be left to making their own decisions. We're going to see some reemergence and actually encouragement on Hoover's part of monopolies and what he will label as beneficial trusts. And of course, when we get to Herbert Hoover, after Calvin Coolidge decides to not run for a second term, conservative Republicans love this guy, and they're like, who else but Hoover would be the best Republican option moving into the 1930s to solve this economic crisis? And Hoover will use those same kinds of policies of, you know what, let's let private industry solve this recession for us rather than through government mandates. And it's just not going to be enough. Okay. So one more thing about the Harding administration before we move forward. Another example of how the political climate moved back toward the interests of corporations and laissez-faire capitalism. Two big scandals. First, the first one to break was over the Secretary of Interior, who was in charge of U.S. Parks Departments. You remember Teddy Roosevelt created all of these national parks. Well, that progressive president's legacy is somewhat abused under Harding's administration. The Secretary of Interior, Albert Fall, and if you've ever heard of the Fall guy, the person that takes the blame for a much larger problem, Albert Fall, the Secretary of Interior, agrees to lend public land at a low price to the Sinclair Oil Company. Okay. And he takes a cut. He takes what amounts to a bribe in order to lend this public land without the authorization of Congress. Now, the name of this public park is Teapot Dome, and that's in Wyoming. And so the Teapot Dome scandal is a great example of government corruption, private interests running Washington, and bureaucrats like Albert Fall benefiting from their public office and control of the public trust. Okay? Now, the Teapot Dome scandal has another indirect consequence for Harding, and that is the stress of the management of Washington is too much for Harding to handle. He admits readily that he is not cut out for this job. When scandals start to make the press, he goes on a nationwide tour, and he ultimately gets pneumonia. He suffers an embolism, which is a blood clot in his veins, gets thrown up to his brain, and he dies while taking this tour. Another major scandal of Harding's administration breaks shortly after his death, and that is the corrupt behavior of his attorney general. Now, the attorney general is in charge of the Justice Department. They're supposed to be the ones prosecuting criminals. And in this particular case, the attorney general for Warren Harding, a guy by the last name of Daughtry, is investigated by the U.S. Senate for the sale of illegal pardons as well as liquor permits. Keep in mind, we're in the time of Prohibition, and here the attorney general, the top law enforcement agent, is permitting certain businesses to sell alcohol. He was forced to resign in 1927. He was indicted on criminal charges, and in twice, juries came back with a hung jury, and eventually the charges were dismissed by the new attorney general. But that kind of corruption dogs the legacy of Harding. I guess Harding's great escape, his own death, prevented him from the embarrassment. Here's the message, though. Harding, Coolidge, and then Herbert Hoover reduce wartime government controls like the War Industries Board. They return the public trust to the private sector, as they do with the railroads, and as some of these examples I've given you, where participation in progressive controls are voluntary, which private industry is not going to do unless it benefits them directly. So when Harding dies, the presidency moves to Vice President Calvin Coolidge, who, as far as his personal characteristics, couldn't have been more different than Harding's, where Harding was a likable, affable guy who was a buddy to everyone, regardless of his limited intellect. Coolidge, people would say, was weaned on a pickle. Very serious, dour, a incredibly shy individual. Once at a party at the White House, a wife of a senator made a bet with someone that she could get him to say more than 3 words. And at the end of the night, Coolidge slipped her a note, and it said, "You lose." So maybe there's some humor in that, but Coolidge, Silent Cal, was a moral, likable individual, but incredibly temperate, silent, and yet politically similar to Harding, in that he believed that America was built by the gods of industry, and anyone that worked in a factory worshiped that god. And so what I'm really saying there is his sympathies lied with free market capitalism and corporations that created the industry of the United States. So he was inaugurated. In fact, he was sworn into office by his father, who was a justice of the peace, at the family's retreat. You can see that in the background, old log cabin, and it didn't have any electricity. He was sworn on the family Bible by the light of 2 kerosene lamps, and so that's kind of a charming, folksy tale to tell. Issue number 3, as far as causes of the Great Depression beyond overspeculation, that is going to be, and this is probably one of the most important. I should have maybe put this at the top of the list, but chronologically it makes more sense to put it here. The economic anemia of Europe and nations that had suffered under World War I. Okay? Britain and the European continent never really fully recovered from World War I. They did not get the roaring 20s like the United States did. Or there'll be times where it looks like the depression and the struggle coming out of World War I are about to break, and the United States actually makes it worse. I hate to say it, but many of the conditions of the Great Depression were brought on or made more severe by America's narrow, self-interested policies. We could even say greed. And really, we need to look at 2 elements there. Number 1, increased tariffs. Now, we've talked about tariffs. You can remember all the way back to the American system, right? And modest tariffs and the debate over the tariffs between the Whigs and the Democrats and so on and so forth. But once again, tariffs are a major issue in American history. And the tariffs America puts up after World War I are going to be incredibly hard on our trade partners. And number 2, our insistence that our allies repay their war debts. And this is going to lead to a very serious unintended consequence. The frustration, the agony, the unnecessary suffering will lead to a charismatic individual in Germany to really play off the fears and frustrations of his countrymen and rise to power. And I'm referring to Adolf Hitler in Germany. So let's start with number 1, the tariffs. Okay. America's experiment with getting entwined with international affairs results in a quick pendulum swing back to isolation. Okay. The 1920s, the success and the affluence that's experienced in the 1920s makes no one eager to relive World War I times where we are wrapped up in affairs far away from home. So people are enjoying the 1920s. They're enjoying themselves. Prosperity seems endless. And what America decides to do is to try to keep that for themselves. Okay. And so we see the passage of the Ford-Macumber tariff law, which raises the tariff 11.5%. Now, that in and of itself is pretty modest. Okay. 11.5%. We've seen jumps like that before. But more importantly, what it does is it allows the president latitude to increase or decrease the tariff by up to 50%. Okay. So any given president, through executive order under the Ford-Macumber tariff law, can increase or decrease tariffs as much as 50%. Well, spoiler alert, what do you think is going to happen? Well, in the 6 years of the Harding and Coolidge administrations, the United States increases the tariff 32 times, and it only reduces the tariff 5 times. And so this political cartoon really encapsulates the impact of our business decisions. Europeans are suffering to be able to afford American-made goods, right? They need money. In order to make money, you need to be able to sell your own goods. Europe needs to rebuild its own industry. And in order to sell your goods, you need markets. And you would think free trade would mean the United States would receive European goods so that the economic cycle could take place. But instead, high tariffs on European goods means that they're not going to be purchased in markets like the United States, the biggest market for Britain and other European countries, which means that Europeans are not going to be making money or having jobs. And so this image, you can see the kind of Mr. Moneybags looking figure suggesting that while he deeply sympathizes with this European mother, he cannot be associated with her. So like I said, America needed to give a chance to its European trade partners to make a profit so that they could buy U.S. exports, and Americans could in turn purchase European imports. And really, money is the fuel that keeps the economic cycle turning. This machine is going to run dry. But not before Europe plays tit for tat. Tariff raising, economic sanctions, those kinds of things can be a two-way street. And so if the United States isn't going to buy British and European goods on a fair and free market, then those countries are going to try to make profits through taxation of American exports. And so American goods, their price increases in Europe, and you can imagine what's going to happen there. As prices increase, demand is going to decrease. We've already talked about how U.S. companies aren't responding to supply and demand. They're just using free credit, low credit to continue to expand their operations and productions. We're going to get stagflation. That's when prices increase, wages and money spent decrease, and we have a stagnant, inflated economy. Adolf Hitler is going to write about this abuse of power and economic manipulation in his book, Mein Kampf. Issue number 2 is America's insistence on being repaid its war debts. America had never been a major creditor in world economics to this point. In fact, prior to World War I, America was a modest debtor. Some debt of about $4 billion owed to mostly European countries. And by the time we get through World War I and into the Roaring 20s, America has invested in its allies and then invests in European reconstruction to the tune of $16 billion. So now we have become a creditor, the possessor of world's wealth, and we are lending it in a very frugal and aggressive kind of way. And what I mean by aggressive is that despite the fact that the French and the British had been fighting a common enemy, Imperial Germany, Austria-Hungary, for multiple years before the United States entered, and despite their sacrifices in blood and treasure in the early years of the war, America continued to demand that our allies pay back their loans. Now, in the meantime, the loans we had given to Britain, both during and after the war, were fueling our own prosperity at home. So it wasn't like we hadn't benefited from the loans. The average American had greatly benefited from the loans and money given over to Europe, because Europeans are going to exclusively rely on the United States for its reconstruction. So the reasonable thing would have been for the United States to forgive some of these loans, because most of that money had come right back into our system anyway. But the US and the banks, eager to make a profit, eager to push that laissez-faire capitalism, really demanded that our allies repay their loans. And as a consequence, then Britain and France are going to demand that Germany repay its debts as well as its reparations, its war guilt fines, as a way that Britain and France could then repay the US Treasury. So what we have here on this graphic is a really easy way to understand this. The United States investors, the stock market, the United States sent about $10 billion additionally to Germany after World War I. And Germany uses that money then to pay back Britain and France and pay off some of its debts, and those countries are going to send it back to the US Treasury. Well, what was primary issue number one as far as US policy goes? Tariffs. Okay, so tariffs are going to make it difficult for those countries to add any of their own money back into the system. And eventually the fuel that we're putting in is not enough fuel for this whole system to cycle around. Germany tries to catch up on its debts and make good on its reparations and loan payments by inflating its currency, printing more money, saying it's worth more than it actually is. And ultimately what that leads to is inflation. This lady here is actually fueling her kitchen stove with German Deutschmarks. At one point, the cost of a loaf of bread in Germany is several million Deutschmarks. I mean, the paper is worth more than the actual value of the currency is. And so we see Germans using Deutschmarks to line their cabinets, to burn as fuel, because Germany's economy means nothing. It's absolutely worthless. In 1924, then, the United States tries to address the issue of German inflation and this stalled out economic system through the Dawes Plan. And this was negotiated by Vice President Charles Dawes. And really what it did was put Germany into a type of bankruptcy where the United States set up a new payment plan with Germany. It rescheduled its war debts. It provided Germany $10 billion more in loans. and as an effort to try to jumpstart Germany's economy again. Now, that's going to have some success. In fact, as we get into the later 1920s, Germany appears to be coming out of its depression. But there's one more tariff that we need to explore here. Okay? The United States just doesn't understand, or at least politicians in the United States don't understand or fully appreciate how damaging these tariffs are to the improvement of Europe's economy and the sustaining of the US economy. And that brings us to issue number 4, and cause of the Great Depression. Now, some of this is within our control, and some of it is not. The late 1920s and the early 1930s is some of the worst times for U.S. farmers. You've heard of the Dirty 30s, farming practices that didn't rotate crops, the tilling of the Great Plains and removing of the sod creates loose soil, its nutrients used up. High windstorms, imagine Nebraska with windstorms, create this dust bowl, but dry conditions and poor farming practices make it more difficult to earn a living as a farmer, especially in the Midwest. Furthermore, farmers are going through some of the same experiences that manufacturers had experienced with their own businesses, and that the improvement of technology, such as the tractor, are allowing farmers to produce more goods, and as an effort to try to recompensate for lost revenue, farmers engage in overproduction. So machines and desperation once again lead to a self-inflicted injury in the United States. The protections farmers had experienced during World War I also end. The Wartime Production Board, which had bought up grain and stored grain and seemed to have a ceaseless demand for U.S. agricultural goods, as we've talked about, are closed down. And so as a consequence, U.S. farmers turn to Washington for answers, for solutions. And there are many schemes as to how to fix the plight of farmers, but the election of 1928 seems to offer some hope of success in the Republican Party. Now, the Democrats had all kinds of issues. Their political leader was Al Smith. Al Smith was a wet. He supported the removal of prohibition. He was also Catholic, and he was the son of Irish immigrants, and he was from New York. And so as a Northern Irish immigrant Catholic who supported the resumption of alcohol production, Alcoholic Smith was not someone who was widely supported in the South, where nationalist sentiments against Catholics and Irish were especially strong. He wasn't a particularly strong candidate in the Midwest and the West because of his ties to New York City. And so farmers in the rest of the nation turned to who else but Herbert Hoover. And Hoover offers farmers some sense of a promise for a better future when he campaigns to bring about some limited change to the U.S. tariff. Now, we've already talked about how presidents had the capacity to increase the US tariff by up to 50%. So we already know that if new legislation is going to be brought about, it has to be a tariff that will extend beyond the 50% tariff marker on foreign goods. Oh, Herbert Hoover, what have you done? Well, Hoover and the Republican Congress forced through one of the most destructive pieces of legislation in our nation's economy's history, and that is the Hawley-Smoot tariff of 1930. The tariff is going to go beyond any tariff in peacetime in American history prior to and since this time, a 60% tariff on foreign goods, which means you're only, 40% shy of paying twice the value of for a foreign produced good as you are for the cost of its production. So to foreigners, this is really going to feel like economic warfare. Think about, in recent times, our president has talked about a trade war with China and increasing tariffs, and China retaliates with that, and there are economic consequences. Now, it isn't to say that no one knew this was coming. Economists protested the White House ferociously, saying that you cannot improve trade through its restraint. And yet, this was something that Hoover felt was necessary in keeping with his campaign promises to the Midwest. And so the Hawley-Smoot tariff is going to plunge the already limited fuel supply of trade between the United States and Europe. It's going to plunge the gauge on that gas tank to empty. It's going to increase the depression of Europe. It's going to increase the friction between the United States and its allies. And it's going to play right into the hands of this rising political celebrity in Germany who is preaching self-sufficiency and retaliation against the Treaty of Versailles, Adolf Hitler. So we've talked about 5 causes of the Great Depression. We started with overspeculation in the stock market. We've talked about the return of production-friendly business practices, this new laissez-faire that was brought about by the 3 presidential administrations that followed Woodrow Wilson, that being Warren G. Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and Herbert Hoover. We've discussed how overproduction, as a consequence of cheap credit as well as new technologies, led to job loss and lower wages. And we've looked at how American foreign policy in increasing tariffs and demanding repayment of loans from our allies, as well as this farm crisis, number 5, the farm crisis, all lead to decisions that are going to disrupt the free trade and the economic cycle that must exist between any kind of trade partners. The Depression first reverberates in Europe, but because the United States had been experiencing this unprecedented level of prosperity, the higher the rise, the harder the fall. And the Great Depression is going to hit the United States hardest of all. Citizens are going to lose everything. People who want work won't be able to find it. And ironically, many of these people who lose their homes in foreclosures end up living in shanty towns that are derisively labeled Hoovervilles. One of the largest Hoovervilles is in Washington, D.C. They're these corrugated tin shanty towns like this. that were basically makeshifted together out of scrap materials. If you've ever watched the musical Annie, you know we'd like to thank you, Herbert Hoover, for making us what we are today. That particular scene is sung outside of a Hooverville. All right. So next time we will be looking at how do we handle this recession? How do we handle this depression? Is it through free market practices like Herbert Hoover encourages, for business leaders to really guide us through this time of trial? Or is it through government mandate and oversight to a degree the United States had never seen before, in the new direction of Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his New Deal offerings?